The crystalline spires of the Zephyrian royal palace stretched toward the twin suns like fingers reaching for divinity. Princess Lirelai stood on her private balcony, her iridescent scales catching the morning light as she watched the latest batch of suitors arrive in their gleaming starships. Each vessel was more ostentatious than the last, their hulls adorned with precious metals and exotic energy fields that rippled like aurora across their surfaces. She sighed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Another week, another parade of arrogant nobles from across the galaxy, each believing their wealth or status made them worthy of her hand. The Zephyrian princess had endured 300 such courtship ceremonies, and each one left her more convinced that love was nothing more than a political tool wielded by ambitious families seeking to expand their influence. Her mother, Queen Celestara, had been patient thus far, but Lirelai knew that patience was wearing thin. The royal bloodline needed continuation, and as the sole heir to the Zephyrian throne, her duty was clear. Yet every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea of marrying someone who saw her as a prize rather than a person. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of the palace guard drilling in the courtyard below. Their synchronized movements and barked commands provided a rhythmic backdrop to her melancholy thoughts. But today, something was different. Mixed with the metallic clang of ceremonial weapons, she heard an unfamiliar sound, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the palace. Curiosity overrode protocol as Lirelai pressed herself against the balcony railing, peering down at the expansive courtyard. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Among the arriving diplomatic entourages was a figure that stood apart from all the others, not because of elaborate clothing or gleaming technology, but because of his complete lack of such adornments. The human was tall by galactic standards, though unremarkable in build. His dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and his clothing consisted of practical brown leather and dark fabric that showed signs of long travel. But it was not the human himself that commanded attention, it was what walked beside him. The creature was massive, easily twice the size of the palace guard's ceremonial mounts. Its fur was a deep black that seemed to absorb light, broken only by silver markings that traced intricate patterns across its powerful frame. 4 legs supported a body built for both speed and strength, while its elongated muzzle housed teeth that glinted like polished ivory daggers. Most striking of all were its eyes, intelligent amber orbs that surveyed the surroundings with an alertness that spoke of predatory cunning. Yet despite its fearsome appearance, the beast walked calmly beside the human, occasionally nudging him with its great head in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture. The man would respond by scratching behind its ears or along its neck, actions that caused the creature's tail to sway in a manner that could only be described as pleased. The palace guards maintained their formation, but Lirelai could see the tension in their postures. Their grip on their weapons had tightened, and several kept glancing nervously at the approaching pair. The visiting dignitaries were even more obvious in their discomfort. Many had taken steps backward, and a few had positioned their own guards between themselves and the human's companion. "What manner of beast has he brought to my court?" Queen Celestara's voice carried a note of indignation as she joined her daughter on the balcony. The queen's scales shimmered with deep purples and golds, a sign of her advanced age and accumulated wisdom. Her forearms were crossed in a gesture that conveyed both authority and disapproval. "I do not know, mother," Lirelai replied, unable to tear her gaze away from the scene below. "But look how it responds to him. That is no mere beast. There is intelligence there, and trust." The queen's secondary eyes, smaller organs positioned above her primary ones that allowed her species to see emotional auras, focused intently on the pair. After a moment, she made a sound of surprise. "The emotional bond between them. I have never seen anything like it. They are connected on a level that transcends mere companionship. As if sensing their observation, the human looked up toward the royal balcony. His eyes met Lyraleigh's across the distance, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. There was no calculation in his gaze, no scheming ambition, only honest curiosity, and something that might have been gentle amusement. He inclined his head in a respectful nod, then placed his hand on his companion's head. The great beast also looked up, its amber eyes intelligent and assessing. Then, to the amazement of everyone in the courtyard, it performed what could only be described as a bow, lowering its front legs and dipping its head in a gesture of respect that was clearly learned rather than instinctive. A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled crowd. Such a display of trained behavior was extraordinary enough, but the grace with which the creature performed the action suggested a level of understanding that approached sapience. "Fascinating," Queen Celestara murmured. "Captain Zorix." The captain of the palace guard, a grizzled veteran whose scales bore the scars of countless battles, approached the royal balcony and snapped to attention. "Yes, Your Majesty? Who is this human, and what is the nature of his beast?" His credentials identify him as Marcus Chen, a trader and explorer from the human colonies in the Terran sector. As for his companion, the captain paused, consulting a data pad. The creature is listed as a domesticated predator in his travel documents. The species designation is Canis lupus, though that means nothing to our xenobiologists. Lyrelei found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word. A trader and explorer, how different from the pampered nobles who usually sought her hand. And this mysterious creature he called a companion rather than a mount or guard animal. "Has he come as a suitor?" the Queen inquired. "No, Your Majesty. He seeks an audience regarding trade agreements between the human colonies and the Zephyrian Empire. His references are impeccable, and several of our allied worlds vouch for his integrity in business dealings." The princess felt an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that this intriguing human was not another fortune seeker, but disappointment that his presence here had nothing to do with her personally. Down in the courtyard, Marcus Chen was being greeted by the palace's chief diplomat, a thin Zephyrian whose scales had faded to the pale blue of advanced age. The conversation was too distant for Lyrelei to hear, but she could see the respect with which the human was being treated. More importantly, she could see how he never strayed far from his companion, and how the creature remained alert but calm, despite being surrounded by potential threats. "I wish to meet with this human," Lyrelei announced suddenly. Her mother's primary eyes fixed on her with surprise. "Daughter, you have no interest in trade negotiations, and your schedule is full of suitor presentations." "Then I will make time," the princess replied with a determination that surprised even herself. "A being who can inspire such loyalty in a predator, I would know more about him." Queen Celestara studied her daughter for a long moment, her secondary eyes no doubt reading the emotional currents that surrounded Lyrelei. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded slowly. "Very well. We shall receive him in the amber chamber after the midday meal. But Lyrelei—" The Queen's voice carried a warning. "Do not let curiosity lead you into folly. We know nothing of this human's true intentions." As the crowd in the courtyard dispersed and the human was escorted toward the guest quarters, Lyrelei remained on the balcony. She found herself thinking not about the upcoming suitor presentations that would consume her afternoon, but about amber eyes that held intelligence and trust, and about the kind of person who could earn such devotion from a creature that was clearly born to be wild. The morning suns climbed higher, their light growing warmer on her scales, but the princess felt a different kind of warmth building in her chest, the warmth of anticipation for a meeting that might prove far more significant than a simple trade discussion. Hours later, as the appointed time approached, Lyrelay made her way through the palace corridors toward the Amber Chamber. The walls were lined with portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch her passage with varying degrees of approval and disappointment. She had changed from her mourning robes into something more formal, a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her silver blue scales and was adorned with the ceremonial jewelry of her rank. The Amber Chamber was one of the smaller receiving rooms in the palace, chosen specifically because its intimate atmosphere would allow for easier conversation. The walls were indeed made of amber, massive sheets of the fossilized resin that glowed with warm golden light. Preserved within some of the panels were ancient creatures from Zephiria's prehistoric past, their forms eternally frozen in moments of life from millions of years ago. Princess Lyrelay arrived a few minutes early, as was proper, and took her position on the ceremonial chair that had been arranged for the meeting. The seat was carved from a single piece of jade-colored stone and elevated slightly above the floor to maintain the proper hierarchical perspective. 2 guards flanked the chamber's entrance, their presence a reminder of royal protocol even in informal meetings. When the great doors opened to admit the human and his companion, Lyrelay felt her breath catch once again. Seeing them at close range revealed details that distance had obscured. The human moved with a fluid grace that spoke of someone accustomed to physical challenges, and his dark eyes held depths of experience that made him seem older than his apparent years. But it was his companion that truly captured her attention. The creature's size was even more impressive up close. Its shoulders reached the human's chest, and its powerful build suggested capabilities that would make it a formidable opponent for multiple armed warriors. Yet it moved with a silence that was almost supernatural, its great paws making no sound on the polished stone floor. The silver markings in its fur were even more intricate than they had appeared from above, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberately decorative. Marcus Chen approached to the appropriate distance and performed a bow that was both respectful and confident. His companion settled beside him, sitting in a manner that was clearly trained but executed with natural grace. The creature's amber eyes took in every detail of the chamber, but its attention always returned to the human beside it. "Your Highness," Marcus said, his voice carrying a slight accent that marked him as coming from one of the frontier colonies. "I am honored by this audience and grateful for your empire's hospitality." Lyrelay inclined her head in acknowledgement. "The honor is mutual, Marcus Chen. It is not often that we receive visitors with such unique companions." Her gaze settled on the great beast. "Might I ask its name?" A smile crossed the human's features, and for a moment his formal demeanor softened. "Her name is Shadow, Your Highness. She has been my partner for over 8 years now." "Partner?" The word was not one typically used to describe the relationship between a being and their mount or guard animal. "Yes, Your Highness. Shadow is not my property or my tool. She is my friend, my family, and my equal in all things that matter." As if to emphasize his words, the human reached down to gently stroke the creature's head. Shadow's eyes half closed in obvious pleasure, and her tail moved in what could only be interpreted as contentment. The casual affection of the gesture and the obvious mutual trust it represented sent an unexpected flutter through Lyrelay's chest. In all her years of observing the interactions between various species and their animal companions, she had never seen anything approaching this level of emotional connection. "Forgive my curiosity," she said, "but I have never encountered her species before. What manner of creature is she?" "Shadow is what my people call a wolf, Your Highness. Her ancestors were wild predators, apex hunters who roamed the forests and mountains of my homeworld. But thousands of years ago, some of those wolves chose to join their lives with humans. Over generations, They became our companions, our partners in survival. The concept was alien to Liralay's understanding. Most species domesticated other creatures through force, breeding them for specific purposes and maintaining control through various means. The idea of predators choosing to ally themselves with another species, and of that alliance being built on mutual respect rather than dominance, challenged everything she thought she knew about the natural order. "She chose to be with you?" the princess asked. Marcus nodded, his hand still resting on Shadow's head. "In a way, yes. When I was very young, I found her as a pup, barely old enough to survive on her own. Her pack had been killed by raiders, and she was alone and frightened. I could have left her, should have perhaps, since wolves are dangerous and unpredictable. But something in her eyes—" He paused, his gaze distant with memory. "She looked at me with such trust, such hope. I couldn't abandon her. And now? Now she could leave any time she chose. No chains bind her, no conditioning compels her obedience. She stays because she wants to, because we have built something together that neither of us could achieve alone." The human's voice carried a note of wonder, as if even after 8 years he was still amazed by the bond they shared. Liralay found herself leaning forward slightly, captivated by the story. "What did you build together?" "Understanding," Marcus replied simply. "Trust, love, if you will permit me to use such a term. Shadow knows that I will never betray her, never abandon her, never ask her to do anything that would truly harm her, and I know the same of her. We are stronger together than either of us could ever be apart." As if sensing that she was being discussed, Shadow turned her great head toward the princess. Those intelligent amber eyes studied Liralay with an intensity that was almost unnerving, but there was no hostility in the gaze, only curiosity and assessment. After a moment, the wolf's tail gave a small wag, and she made a soft sound that could almost have been a greeting. "I think she likes you, Your Highness," Marcus observed with a smile. The simple statement sent another flutter through Lyralay's chest, though she could not have said why the approval of this creature mattered to her. "How can you tell?" "Her body language, the way she holds her ears. The sound she just made, to those who know how to read her, Shadow is quite expressive. She has good instincts about people." The human's eyes met hers directly, and Liralay saw something there that made her pulse quicken. "She only responds positively to those she senses are genuine, honest in their intentions." The implication of his words was not lost on her, nor was the fact that he had managed to convey a compliment without overstepping the bounds of propriety. Here was someone who could read between the lines of conversation as easily as he read his companion's subtle signals. "You speak of her as if she were a person," Liralay observed. "In all the ways that matter, she is," Marcus replied without hesitation. "She thinks, she feels, she makes decisions based on complex reasoning. The fact that she cannot speak in words does not make her thoughts any less valid than yours or mine." The concept was revolutionary. Throughout the galaxy, intelligence was typically measured by technological achievement, linguistic capability, and abstract reasoning. But this human was suggesting that there were other forms of intelligence, other ways of thinking and being, that deserved equal respect. "Your Highness," Marcus continued, his tone becoming slightly more formal as he returned to the original purpose of his visit, "I hope that the friendship Shadow and I have found might serve as an example of the partnerships possible between our peoples. Humans have much to offer the Zephyrian Empire, not just goods and resources, but perspectives and approaches that could benefit both our civilizations." As he spoke, Liralay found herself only half listening to his words about trade agreements and diplomatic relations. She was far more interested in watching the interplay between the human and his companion, the subtle communications that passed between them, the obvious deep affection that bound them together. Here was something she had never encountered in all her years of royal audiences and formal presentations. A relationship built on genuine equality, mutual respect, and unconditional love. It was everything she had ever hoped to find in her own life, yet had begun to believe was impossible. The meeting continued for another hour, covering the practical details of potential trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. But for Princess Lyrelei, the real discussion had ended with that first exchange about the nature of true partnership. As she watched Marcus Chen and his remarkable companion, she began to understand that perhaps love was not the political tool she had always believed it to be. Perhaps it was something far more powerful and transformative than she had ever dared to imagine. 3 days had passed since the formal audience, and Princess Lyrelei found herself thinking about the human trader far more often than royal protocol would deem appropriate. She had managed to arrange 2 additional meetings under the pretense of reviewing trade proposals, but in truth, she was far more interested in observing the remarkable relationship between Marcus and Shadow than in discussing commercial agreements. During their second meeting in the palace gardens, she had watched Shadow detect a hidden explosive device that palace security had missed, not through any technological scanning, but through her natural senses. The wolf had suddenly gone rigid, her ears pricked forward, and her nose twitching as she caught a scent that alarmed her. Without hesitation, she had positioned herself between Marcus and the concealed threat, her low growl alerting both the human and the nearby guards to danger. When the bomb squad had investigated Shadow's warning, they discovered a sophisticated device that would have detonated during the evening's formal dinner. The plot was traced to a radical faction seeking to disrupt the peace negotiations between several rival worlds. But what struck Lyrelei most profoundly was not the political implications. It was the way Marcus had trusted his companion's instincts without question, and how Shadow had been willing to place herself in danger to protect not just her partner, but everyone in the vicinity. Now, as the morning light filtered through the crystalline windows of her private chambers, Lyrelei made a decision that would have shocked her mother had she known of it. Instead of attending the scheduled presentation by Lord Vexthar of the Crimson Nebula, a wealthy young noble whose preening arrogance had already irritated her during their brief introduction, she donned simple traveling clothes and made her way to the palace stables. If she wanted to truly understand the bond between Marcus and Shadow, she needed to see them in a less formal setting. The human had mentioned that he maintained his own equipment and cared for Shadow's needs personally, declining the palace's offer of servants. According to the stable master, they could be found in the eastern paddocks where visiting dignitaries' mounts were housed. As Lyrelei approached the area, she heard an unfamiliar sound. Marcus's voice, but raised in what sounded like commands mixed with encouragement. Curious, she moved to where she could observe without being seen immediately. What she witnessed took her breath away. Marcus and Shadow were engaged in what could only be described as a dance. The human would give subtle hand signals or brief verbal commands, and Shadow would respond with movements that demonstrated incredible athletic ability and intelligence. She leaped over obstacles, weaved between posts, and performed complex maneuvers that required split-second timing and perfect coordination with her partner. But this was clearly not a mere display of trained tricks. There was joy in Shadow's movements, her tail wagging enthusiastically as she completed each challenge. When Marcus praised her success, she would bound back to him with obvious delight, accepting his affectionate scratches and words of appreciation. This was play, Lyrelei realized. Sophisticated, challenging play that exercised both body and mind. "Your Highness?" Lyrelei spun around, startled by Marcus's voice. He had somehow noticed her presence despite being focused on his companion. Shadow trotted over to sit beside him, her tongue lolling out in what the princess was beginning to recognize as the wolf's expression of happiness. "I apologize for intruding," Lyrelei said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I was curious about your morning routine." "No apology necessary," Marcus replied with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased by her interest. "Shadow and I were just working through some exercises. Would you like to meet her properly?" The invitation was unexpected and thrilling. "Meet her. She's been curious about you since our first audience. Wolves are social creatures. They value relationships and connections. I think she would like to know you better, if you're willing." Lyrelay found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to accept. Marcus gestured for her to approach slowly, his voice taking on a gentle, instructional tone. "Let her come to you," he advised. "Don't reach for her immediately. Let her decide if she wants contact. When she does approach, let her smell your hand first. It's how her people introduce themselves." The princess followed his guidance, standing still as Shadow approached with cautious steps. The wolf's amber eyes studied Lyrelay intently, and she could feel the intelligence behind that gaze weighing and evaluating. After a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, Shadow extended her muzzle toward Lyrelay's outstretched hand. The first contact was tentative, the wolf's nose briefly touching her palm as sense and information were processed. Then, to Lyrelay's amazement and delight, Shadow's tail began to wag, and she pressed her head against the princess's hand in a clear request for contact. Lyrelay's fingers found the incredibly soft fur behind Shadow's ears, and she marveled at the texture and warmth. But what struck her most was the trust implicit in the gesture. This powerful predator was allowing herself to be vulnerable, accepting touch from someone she had only recently met because her partner had indicated it was safe to do so. "She likes you," Marcus observed, moving closer as Shadow leaned into Lyrelay's gentle scratching. "That's not something she offers lightly." "How can you be certain?" the princess asked, though she could feel the rightness of the connection herself. "Watch her body language. See how her eyes are half closed? That means she's relaxed and content. If she were merely tolerating your touch, she would remain alert and tense, ready to withdraw. But she's actually enjoying this." As if to prove his point, Shadow made a soft sound of contentment and shifted to rest more of her weight against Lyrelay's legs. The princess couldn't help but smile at the obvious display of affection from this magnificent creature. "She's beautiful," Lyrelay murmured, running her hands through Shadow's thick fur and feeling the powerful muscles beneath. "And much larger than I expected." "Wolves come in many sizes," Marcus explained, his own hand joining hers in petting his companion. "Shadow's bloodline traces back to the great northern wolves of Earth. They were bred for size and endurance, but more importantly, they were bred for intelligence and loyalty." The casual brush of his fingers against hers sent an unexpected jolt through Lyrelay's system, but she managed to maintain her composure. "How long did it take for her to trust you like this?" Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "Trust isn't built in a day or a week. It's earned through consistency, through proving over and over that you mean what you say and say what you mean. Shadow learned that I would never hurt her, never abandon her, never ask her to compromise her nature for my convenience. In return, she gave me her loyalty, her protection, and her love." The word love hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond the relationship between human and wolf. Lyrelay found herself wondering what it would feel like to be loved with such unwavering devotion, to trust someone so completely that vulnerability became a gift rather than a weakness. "Your Highness!" The sharp voice shattered the moment like crystal striking stone. Chief Counselor Threx strode into the paddock area, his scaled features twisted with disapproval and his 4 arms gesticulating wildly. "What are you doing here?" "Lord Vexthar has been waiting in the amber chamber for over an hour." Lyrelay straightened, her hand automatically pulling away from Shadow's fur as royal protocols reasserted themselves. The wolf, sensing the change in atmosphere, moved to position herself between the princess and the agitated counselor, her hackles rising slightly. "Counselor Threx," Lyrelay said with as much dignity as she could muster, "I was merely investigating our guest's unusual companion for security purposes." The thin excuse fooled no one, least of all the sharp-eyed counselor who had served in the royal court for over 40 years. His gaze moved from the princess to Marcus, and the suspicion in his expression deepened. "Your Highness, you have obligations, duties to your people and your crown. This traitor and his beast are hardly appropriate companions for one of your station." The dismissive tone with which Threx spoke about Marcus and Shadow sparked something protective and fierce in Lyrelay's chest. "This traitor's beast has already proven more valuable to palace security than our own systems. Perhaps we should be showing more respect to those who serve us well." Marcus stepped forward, his posture respectful but firm. "Counselor, I apologize if my presence has caused any inconvenience. Princess Lyrelay was simply being thorough in her evaluation of potential security assets." Threx's secondary eyes focused on the human with obvious distrust. "Yes, I'm sure that's all it was. Human, you would do well to remember your place here. You are a guest, nothing more." The insulting tone was unmistakable, and Lyrelay saw Shadow's ears flatten against her head as the wolf picked up on the hostility. But before anyone could respond further, a commotion erupted from the direction of the palace proper. Shouts echoed across the grounds, followed by the distinctive sound of weapon fire. Through the crystalline walls, they could see guards running toward the main building, their movements urgent and coordinated. "An attack," Threx breathed, his political concerns suddenly forgotten in the face of a more immediate threat. Marcus was already moving, his hand finding the communication device on his belt. "Shadow, seek," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of long practice. The wolf's demeanor transformed instantly. Gone was the playful companion who had been enjoying gentle scratches moments before. In her place stood a predator of devastating capability, every sense focused and alert. She raised her muzzle to test the air currents, her body language speaking of barely contained power ready to be unleashed. Within seconds, Shadow's head snapped toward the northwest section of the palace complex. A low growl rumbled from deep in her chest as she fixed on something beyond human perception. "3 individuals," Marcus interpreted, watching his companion's signals with practiced ease. "Moving through the service corridors toward the royal quarters, armed with energy weapons and some kind of chemical agent. She can smell the foreign compounds." Threx stared at him in disbelief. "How could you possibly know all that?" "Shadow can distinguish between different types of weapon discharge by scent alone. She can identify the number of individuals by tracking their unique pheromone signatures, and her nose can detect chemical compounds at concentrations far below what any scanner could register." Marcus was already moving toward the palace, his companion keeping pace beside him. "Where are the Queen's chambers?" "You cannot possibly think to," Threx began, but Lyrelay cut him off. "Northwest wing, 3rd level, the Sapphire Suite." Her decision was made in an instant. If Marcus and Shadow could help protect her mother, then protocol and propriety could wait. As they raced through the palace corridors, Lyrelay found herself amazed by the coordination between human and wolf. Marcus never had to check Shadow's position or worry about her keeping up. She flowed beside him like his own shadow, anticipating his movements and adjusting her pace to match his needs. When they reached a junction where the corridors branched, Shadow would indicate the correct path with subtle movements of her head, her supernatural senses tracking their quarry through stone and steel. The palace guard was in chaos. The attackers had apparently used some form of sophisticated jamming technology that disrupted the standard communication networks and security systems. Guards were running in random directions, unable to coordinate their response or even determine the exact nature of the threat. But Marcus and Shadow cut through the confusion like a blade through silk. The wolf's natural tracking abilities were unaffected by electronic countermeasures, and Marcus's experience in frontier conflicts had taught him how to function effectively when technology failed. They reached the royal quarters just as the first explosion echoed through the corridors. The attackers had breached the outer security barriers and were making their final assault on the Queen's chambers. Through the crystalline walls, they could see armed figures in black combat suits moving with military precision. "There," Marcus pointed to a service entrance that would allow them to approach from an unexpected angle. "Shadow can take point. Her natural stealth abilities will get us close without being detected." As they moved into position, Lyrelai realized that she was about to witness something extraordinary. This was not a demonstration or an exercise. This was Marcus and Shadow operating as they had been trained to do, as partners facing genuine danger together. The wolf moved like liquid darkness through the shadows, her black fur blending seamlessly with the unlit service corridors. Marcus followed her lead, trusting her senses and instincts completely. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, only the smooth cooperation of two beings who had learned to function as a single unit. When they reached their position, Shadow froze, her body language indicating immediate threat. Through the transparent wall sections, they could see the attackers placing explosive charges around the Queen's chamber doors. In moments, those barriers would be breached, and Lyrelai's mother would be at the mercy of beings whose intentions were clearly hostile. Marcus placed his hand on Shadow's head, and some form of silent communication passed between them. The wolf's amber eyes met his dark ones, and Lyrelai could almost see the understanding that flowed between them. No words were needed. They both knew what had to be done. What happened next would remain etched in the princess's memory for the rest of her life. Marcus and Shadow moved as one being, their assault perfectly coordinated and devastatingly effective. The wolf hit the first attacker like a force of nature, her powerful jaws and claws disabling him before he could even cry out. Marcus engaged the second attacker with skills that spoke of extensive combat training, while Shadow flowed around their fight to neutralize the third threat. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 highly trained assassins lay unconscious on the floor, their weapons scattered, and their mission failed completely. Marcus stood over them, breathing hard but apparently uninjured, while Shadow sat calmly beside him as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Queen Celestara emerged from her chambers, her 4 arms holding ceremonial weapons that she clearly knew how to use. Her eyes took in the scene, the disabled attackers, the human and his companion, and her daughter standing in the doorway with obvious admiration written across her features. "It appears," the Queen said with considerable dignity, "that we are in your debt, Marcus Chen." The human bowed respectfully, one hand resting on Shadow's head. "No debt, Your Majesty. We were honored to be of service." As palace security finally arrived to secure the attackers and restore order, Lyrelai found herself looking at Marcus and Shadow with new eyes. She had witnessed something that challenged every assumption she had ever held about the nature of partnership, loyalty, and love. Here was a bond that transcended species, a connection that made each participant stronger and more capable than they could ever be alone. And as Marcus turned to check on her welfare, the concern in his eyes purely personal rather than diplomatic, Princess Lyrelai began to understand that her heart might be in serious danger of being captured by this remarkable human and his equally remarkable companion. The investigation into the assassination attempt revealed disturbing truths that shook the foundations of Zephyrian politics. The attackers were not random terrorists, but highly trained operatives funded by a coalition of noble houses who opposed Queen Celestara's progressive policies regarding interspecies cooperation. More specifically, they opposed the Queen's growing openness to deeper alliances with what they considered lesser species, particularly humans. Lord Vexthar of the Crimson Nebula, the very suitor Princess Lyrelai had avoided meeting that fateful morning, was revealed to be one of the conspiracy's key figures. His courtship of the princess had been a calculated move to gain political influence and shift the Empire's policies toward greater isolationism and species supremacy. The revelations came during an emergency council session held in the Great Assembly Hall, its soaring crystal architecture designed to accommodate representatives from dozens of different worlds and species. Lyrelai sat beside her mother on the elevated royal platform, watching as evidence of the conspiracy was presented to the assembled nobles and diplomats. Marcus Chen had been invited to attend as a witness and advisor, a gesture that spoke volumes about how dramatically his status had changed in the wake of recent events. He sat in the section reserved for honored guests, with Shadow lying calmly beside his chair, despite the intimidating presence of hundreds of beings from across the galaxy. Several times during the proceedings, Lyrelai found her gaze drifting toward them, noting how Marcus seemed completely at ease in the political maelstrom while Shadow remained alert but untroubled by the chaos of scents, sounds, and emotional currents surrounding them. "The evidence is overwhelming," declared Chief Investigator Morlex, her tentacled arms gesticulating as she presented data projections above the assembly floor. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign to destabilize the crown and reverse decades of diplomatic progress. Lord Vexthar himself sat in the defendants section, his crimson scales dulled with defeat, but his eyes still burning with unrepentant hatred. When given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, he chose instead to deliver a venomous speech that revealed the true depth of his prejudice. "You sit here, pretending that all species are equal," he snarled, his gaze moving from the Queen to Marcus and finally settling on Shadow with obvious disgust. "But look around you. We are the Zephyrian Empire, inheritors of the greatest civilization this galaxy has ever known. And now we're supposed to bow down to primitive traders and their animal companions?" A murmur of shock rippled through the assembly at the naked hostility in his words. But Vexthar was not finished. "That creature," he pointed directly at Shadow, "is nothing more than a sophisticated pet, yet you treat it with more respect than the noble bloodlines that built this empire. You're so eager to embrace these humans that you've forgotten what true civilization looks like." The insult to Shadow struck Lyrelai like a physical blow, and she saw Marcus's hand tighten on the arm of his chair. But before anyone could respond, something unprecedented happened. Shadow rose from her resting position and walked calmly to the center of the assembly floor. The great hall fell silent as hundreds of beings watched the wolf move with dignified grace to a position directly in front of Vexthar's platform. There she sat, her amber eyes fixed on the Crimson Lord with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. For a long moment, predator and prey regarded each other in absolute silence. Then, Shadow did something that would be talked about in diplomatic circles for generations to come. She tilted her head slightly, opened her mouth in what any human would recognize as a gentle smile, and wagged her tail once, a gesture of dismissive amusement that somehow managed to convey more eloquent contempt than any verbal response could have achieved. The message was unmistakable. She found Vexthar's hatred and fear amusing rather than threatening, unworthy of serious concern from a being of her capabilities and intelligence. Laughter began somewhere in the diplomatic section and spread through the assembly like ripples on a pond. Not mocking laughter, but the kind of genuine amusement that comes from witnessing perfect timing and devastating wit. Even some of Vexthar's own supporters seemed unable to suppress their appreciation for Shadow's wordless rebuttal. "It would appear," Queen Celestera observed with the slightest hint of a smile, that wisdom and dignity are not always linked to the ability to speak in words. As Shadow returned to her place beside Marcus, Lyrelay felt something crystallize in her mind. This was the moment when she understood with perfect clarity what she wanted from her life and what she was willing to fight for to get it. The formal proceedings continued for several more hours, with various nobles presenting their positions on the conspiracy and its implications for the Empire's future. But Princess Lyrelay's attention was focused on planning for a conversation she knew she needed to have, one that would determine the course of her entire future. When the assembly finally adjourned, she made her way directly to Marcus, who was preparing to leave with Shadow. "Might I speak with you privately?" she asked, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. His eyes searched her face, no doubt reading the emotions she was trying to keep controlled. "Of course, Your Highness. Where would you prefer?" "The Moon Garden. In 1 hour." The Moon Garden was one of the palace's most secluded spaces, a place where the royal family traditionally went for private reflection. It was enclosed by walls of translucent crystal that filtered the light of Zephiria's twin moons into patterns of silver and blue. Ancient trees from across the galaxy grew there, their various forms creating a landscape that was both alien and achingly beautiful. When Marcus arrived with Shadow, Lyrelay was waiting beside the central fountain, its crystalline waters creating a gentle musical accompaniment to the evening air. She had chosen to wear simple robes rather than formal court dress, wanting this conversation to be between them as individuals rather than as representatives of their respective positions. "You wanted to speak with me?" Marcus said, his tone carefully neutral as he approached. "I wanted to ask you something," Lyrelay replied, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling. "When you and Shadow work together, when you face danger or make important decisions, how do you know you can trust each other completely?" The question was not what he had expected, and she saw him consider it seriously before answering. "Trust isn't something you know," he said finally. "It's something you choose, every day, in every moment. Shadow and I have been through situations where our lives depended on that choice, where hesitation or doubt would have meant death for both of us. And you never question it? Never wonder if perhaps you've made the wrong choice?" Marcus looked at Shadow, who was sitting quietly nearby but clearly listening to every word. "There was a time, early in our partnership, when I doubted. We were crossing a frozen river, and Shadow refused to follow the path I had chosen. She kept pulling toward a different route, one that looked more dangerous to my eyes. I could have forced her to obey. She was young enough then that my will might have overridden her instincts. But you didn't." "No. I chose to trust her judgment even though I didn't understand it. We took her path and discovered later that the route I had wanted to take would have led us over thin ice that would never have supported our weight. Her natural senses had detected the danger that my technology and logic had missed." Lyrelay absorbed this, understanding the deeper meaning behind the story. "And since then?" "Since then, I've never questioned her insights, and she's never questioned my commitment to her well-being. We've built something that neither of us could achieve alone, a partnership based on absolute trust and mutual respect." The princess took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would irrevocably change the direction of her life. "I want to ask you something that may be inappropriate and that you have every right to refuse to answer." Marcus waited, his dark eyes patient and kind. "If someone offered you that same kind of partnership, that same level of trust and commitment, but the price was giving up everything you had worked for, everything you had planned for your life, would you consider it?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the musical sound of the fountain and the soft whisper of alien breezes through exotic foliage. Shadow's ears were pricked forward, as if she too was waiting for the answer. "Your Highness," Marcus said carefully, "are you asking what I think you're asking?" I'm asking, Lyrelay replied with as much courage as she could muster, if you might be willing to stay here on Zephyria, not as a trader or diplomat, but as someone who might be interested in building a different kind of partnership. Now it was Marcus's turn to be stunned into silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with wonder. Lyrelay, you're a princess. You're heir to an empire that spans dozens of worlds. I'm a frontier trader with no noble bloodline, no political connections, no wealth beyond my ship and my companion. What could I possibly offer you? Everything I've been searching for my entire life, she replied without hesitation. Honesty, integrity. The kind of love that isn't based on political advantage or social climbing. Someone who would choose to be with me not because I'm a princess, but because I'm me. She stepped closer to him, her silver blue scales catching the moonlight as she moved. I've watched you with Shadow, seen how you treat someone you love. You don't try to control her or change her. You accept her as she is and help her become the best version of herself. You trust her completely, and she returns that trust with absolute loyalty. And you want that, Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. I want that more than I want the crown, more than I want the approval of the court, more than I want anything else in this galaxy. The words came pouring out of her now, months of suppressed feelings finally finding voice. I want someone who will see me for who I really am, not what I represent. I want to build something together that neither of us could achieve alone. Marcus looked at Shadow, and once again that silent communication passed between them. The wolf's tail wagged once, and she made a soft sound that somehow conveyed approval and encouragement. She likes the idea, Marcus said with a smile that transformed his entire face. And so do I. But Lyrelay, the obstacles can be overcome, she interrupted. My mother has been pushing me to choose a consort, and the law allows me to select anyone I deem worthy. The recent assassination attempt has shown the court that political marriages offer no guarantee of loyalty or safety. If anything, your actions have proven that honor and courage aren't restricted to those born with noble titles. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his. But I need to know that this isn't just gratitude or infatuation speaking. I need to know that you could love me for myself, not for my position or the advantages it might bring. Marcus turned his hand over so that their palms touched, and Lyrelay felt the warmth of his skin against hers. I fell in love with a curious, intelligent woman who wasn't afraid to pet a predator because she wanted to understand the bond between us. I fell in love with someone brave enough to risk political scandal by spending time in the stables instead of attending formal court presentations. I fell in love with a person who saw Shadow not as a monster to be feared, but as an individual worthy of respect and affection. His other hand came up to gently cup her face, and Lyrelay felt her heart skip as she saw the depth of emotion in his eyes. Your titles and your crown are part of who you are, but they're not why I love you. The word love hung between them like a bridge spanning two worlds, and Lyrelay knew that crossing it would change everything forever. But as she looked into Marcus's honest, caring face, and as Shadow moved closer to rest her great head against both their legs in a gesture of acceptance and blessing, she knew that some bridges were meant to be crossed. Then stay, she whispered. Stay and help me build something extraordinary. When Marcus kissed her, it was with the same gentle confidence he showed in all his interactions with Shadow. Patient, respectful, and absolutely committed. And when Shadow's tail wagged enthusiastically and she made soft sounds of contentment, Lyrelay knew that she had gained not just a partner, but a family. The announcement of Princess Lyrelay's engagement to Marcus Chen sent shockwaves through the galactic diplomatic community and sparked heated debates in noble houses across the empire. But as the weeks passed and the couple appeared together at various public functions, always with Shadow at their side, Even the most skeptical observers had to admit that this was clearly a partnership built on genuine affection rather than political maneuvering. The wedding ceremony, held 6 months later in the Great Crystal Cathedral, broke with centuries of Zephyrian tradition. Instead of the usual formal exchange of vows between representatives of two noble houses, it was a celebration of the bond between three individuals who had chosen to build their lives together. When Marcus placed the traditional Zephyrian bonding crystal around Lyralei's neck, he spoke words that would be remembered long after the political implications of their union had faded into history. "I promise to love you as Shadow loves me, completely, honestly, and without reservation. I promise to trust your judgment even when I don't understand it, and to support your dreams even when they lead us into unknown territories." When Lyralei responded by placing a matching crystal around Marcus's neck, her words were equally profound. "I promise to accept you as you are, while helping you become everything you're meant to be. I promise to build with you something that neither of us could achieve alone, a love that transcends species, status, and all the boundaries that others use to divide us." But perhaps the most memorable moment of the ceremony came when Shadow stepped forward and gently took the third crystal, a specially commissioned piece that bore the wolf's own unique design, in her teeth, and offered it to the couple together. As they fastened it around her neck, creating a three-way bond that symbolized their unusual family, there was not a dry eye in the cathedral. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the Zephyrian Empire from a rigid hierarchical society to one of the galaxy's most progressive and inclusive civilizations, they would point to this moment as a turning point. The marriage between Princess Lyralei and Marcus Chen, blessed by a creature that most of the galaxy considered nothing more than an intelligent animal, challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, love, and partnership that rippled outward to affect policies and attitudes across dozens of worlds. But for the three individuals at the center of it all, the significance was much simpler. They had found something that all the wealth and power in the galaxy couldn't buy, a love that was freely given, unconditionally maintained, and built on the unshakable foundation of absolute trust. In the end, it wasn't the princess who captured the human's heart, or the human who captured the princess's heart. It was something far more extraordinary. Three very different beings who discovered that love, in its purest form, recognizes no boundaries save those we impose upon ourselves. And as Shadow had shown from that very first meeting, sometimes the most profound truths can be communicated without words, through nothing more than an open heart and the courage to trust in something greater than fear.